If I had an opportunity, I would have changed the sermon title to just Nice Guys Come Second. Because the way it's printed now sounds like, something very important and a thesis or a lecture on important and heavy matters. It addresses, I think, a very important matter, but the scope of one simple sermon is way too short and too small to try and even scratch the surface of the matters that are on the table when you look at moral behavior in a complex environment. So, as somebody who often rushes in where I shouldn't have gone, I did this again, but I think it's essential to do it. I think it is essential for us to take the time and contemplate our behavior as Christians, as Americans, as members of the human race, or most of us at least, I think. In every context, especially if you look at the national scene where winning at all costs and by any method is revered and regarded as appropriate by most. It is, you can say, unappetizing, but I think it is detrimental to the soul of our nation. I think it's damaging the fiber of who we are, and I think a lot of that spills over in many other communities and micro-societies. I will obviously not be able to cover all the sub-themes and not even the most important themes that one has to tend to when you try to address this. Let me revert first back to what I suggested, the sermon title, Nice Guys Come Second. What that should have been. That is the title of a book published by John Gainsford. Now, I don't think anybody here would know who John Gainsford is, or was. I think he passed away. He was the captain of the All Black, the New Zealand rugby team, when I was in high school. One of the major stars in the firmament of rugby in those days. And he published that book, Nice Guys Come Second, saying that, to be on top in the rugby world, you have to sometimes do stuff that is not nice. Otherwise, the other guy will do it to you first. And you will be taken out of the game and so forth. And I often struggled at school with those ethical questions, because I played hooker, and that's the guy in the center of when those two scrums set. Both your arms are, you cannot use your hands for anything, you have to hold on to the props, and when you go down, it's common practice in rugby that they take out the hooker, break his nose, or, rub deep it into his eyes so that you cannot see for the rest of the game. And then it was a struggle, what do you do? I'm stating the extreme. It's not everybody that does that, but sometimes the stakes get high in those games. So Gainsford wrote this book, and I was curious. I wondered, did he invent that phrase? Where does it come from? And I found, like so many other things, in the world that is essential and important and of great magnitude, even, I would say, comes from the world of Major League Baseball. Many philosophical statements originate there, truths about life. And this one was actually formulated by Leo Durocher, who was a coach. I don't know who of you know that name. For 26 years, I read in the Major League Baseball. He coached the Cubs, among other teams. And in 1946, he coined that phrase looking at the tables in the standing of the teams on the roster, and he said, nice guys finish last. That was how he phrased it. Nice guys finish last. Moving on from that, I've addressed somewhat the national scene and the influence on our living of every day as Americans and also as Christians. It gets particularly difficult, like what we find ourselves in now as a congregation, with this Fields Project and people on both sides of the issue, congregation voting this way and some people not agreeing with that. And I've already spoken on that and said, listen, we have to accommodate each other and respect each other's perspective. All of us are part of the same body of Christ. Clarity on that, no question on that. But it is a very intense issue. Everybody is committed to a certain perspective. And it's very personal, because we look each other in the eye here, at least on a Sunday and sometimes during the week as well. We see each other and we know this person sees the issue this way. So what do we do? How do we go about our business? It's part of the bigger question of how do you behave and how do you resist something that you don't agree with, and in the most extreme, and I'm not saying it applies to our situation here, how do you resist in an ethical way what you regard as wrong or evil? Again, it does not apply evil or to our situation, but that's the broader question. How do you do it? Often when you have two communities overlapping and people finding themselves simultaneously in different communities like us, the church, which is a faith community but also embedded in the bigger community of the town of Topsfield and the broader region. In this case, the town of Topsfield and the church. Sometimes the boundaries of the different communities seem to be diffuse or porous, or even get suspended. And I think one guideline that one can formulate in our dealing and our wrestling and our struggling with this theme is that if you say, for instance, you are part of this covenant community, but there is behavior that places you on a collision course with the behavioral contract that we all enter to when we become part of this covenant community, then we self-select to place ourselves outside that community. And then we can no longer say, I belong to that community, until such time as we've sat down, look each other in the eye, and had our conversation about what constitutes covenantal behavior. I also think it's essential for us not to shy away from these issues, but to address them head on, as we are called by our tradition to do. I think it is good to look at what does that book say, the good book, as it is also called. What does our tradition say about this complex issue? How do you go about it? I think it's good to look at the teachings of Jesus. What did he say? What did he do about it? And Charlotte read a passage from the book of Matthew, chapter 5, where Jesus starts off in that brief teaching with words from the Old Testament, from the book of Exodus chapter 21 and also Leviticus chapter 24. And this is not the first place where these words are used in laws or to give direction or guidance to people. It's also found in the Babylonian law, the Code of Hammurabi, one of their well-known kings. This, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus says, this is what you know the Jewish traditions say. And those that think it is a horrible thing to say that is very harsh. You cannot go about your business like that, to say, I'll retaliate in equal measure. Those that are kind to this guideline say, no, that is just a way to say your response should not go overboard, but be in equal measure, not to punish someone more than what is needed. The teaching of Jesus on this continues. What does he say? He uses 3 examples. He speaks about hitting, the cultural practice of hitting. He speaks about a backhander, and I've talked about this before. It's very important how you hit somebody in the first century in that society. If you hit somebody with an open palm, like this, that is how you would hit an equal. So by hitting somebody like this on the proper cheek, you say, I regard you as my equal. I have a difference with you and I express myself this way. If you give a backhander, through that you say, you are my inferior. I'm in charge here, I'm in power, therefore I hit you with the back of my hand. What do you do when somebody hits you with the back of your hand? You turn the other cheek. That forces that person either to move around so that he continues to hit you with the back of the hand, or to hit you with an open palm like you would hit an equal. So you force him either to regard you as his equal or to move around you. So you take charge of the situation, say, I am not submitting myself to your will. You may be an evildoer, you may be abusing your power, you may be hitting me, but I'm in charge here. I will force you to do what I want you to do, to resist it in that way. The same way with the carrying of a load or a pack. It was allowed for a soldier to force someone to carry their pack for 1 mile. That was allowed by the law of the Romans. So if a Roman soldier would take you and say, carry this thing for me for 1 mile, and after that mile you would just continue on walking, that could bring that soldier into big trouble with his commanders. It will also create a commotion, because what is the Roman soldier forced to do? He is forced to run after you, to catch you, and to wrestle that pack from you. And you can see all the Jews that were in any case angry with the Romans gathering, starting a riot there. Look at what this Roman is doing. So again, you take charge of the situation. You're forcing the other person to follow your will and to do what you required. And the third one is the situation of public nudity. It was customary, for instance, for a debt to be repaid to take the top coat of someone. But now Jesus says, if somebody takes your top coat or your garment, also take off your undercoat, your undies. Give that to the person. So there you stand in all your glory, nude in public. And the cultural behavior around that was, nudity is not allowed. But the shame is on the one who causes the nudity or who observes the nudity. So if somebody strips in public, not because somebody took the overcoat, powerful person, and now the undies are gone as well. The shame is on that person forcing that person to taking his undercoat, and the shame is on everybody seeing the nudity. Again, displeasure for being shamed by this person taking the top coat. This is passive resistance. Non-violent passive resistance. In a clever way, assuming control of the situation and not submitting yourself to the will of the one that is doing the wrong thing. If we look at somebody like Gandhi, that was known for his revolution that he caused through passive resistance. And Gandhi said about the tradition of an eye for an eye, he said that'll leave the whole world blind if we always follow that guideline. And he also said, while going about his business in India, streams of blood will have to flow in our revolution before we are free. But it'll have to be our blood. Very firm on passive, non-violent resistance. Martin Luther King was also somebody that studied Gandhi and that applied the principles in his own way in the US. I can read you a few of his statement. Nonviolent resistance is not for cowards. It is not a quiet, passive acceptance of evil. One is passive and nonviolent physically, but very active spiritually, always seeking ways to persuade the opponent of advantages to the way of love, cooperation, and peace. Then the goal is not to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but rather to win him or her over to understanding new ways to create cooperation and community. And so on and so forth. A lot to read and to share. After reading too much and coming to the conclusion that we should rather have a series of conversations around this than a sermon, I arrived at another passage, just one verse, that I think is applicable. It's also from Matthew. Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, where Jesus says to his disciples, when he sends them out into the world, he says, I'm sending you out like sheep among a pack of wolves. Therefore, be cautious as the snakes, or wise as the snakes, and innocent or pure as the doves. Cautious as a snake and innocent or pure as a dove. One translation that I sometimes consult and that I know a few people in the Bible study groups prefer is the Message translation. The Message translates these words, that verse about the snakes and the dove, stay alert. This is hazardous work I'm assigning you. You are going to be like sheep running through a wolf pack. So don't call attention to yourselves. Be as cunning as a snake, as inoffensive as a dove. In this case, that translation by Peterson, the guy who did the translation of the Message, didn't sit that well with me. Because I don't think you'll get very far in the world if you are as inoffensive as a dove. One commentary I read from a Jewish source says this is probably a proverb that originated in the Jewish world and on which there is also rabbinical commentary, rabbis that discussed it. And the commentary that they refer to from the Songs of Songs Rabbah 2, verse 34. The Holy One says, with me they are innocent like doves, but with the nations they are cunning like serpents. I dived into the Greek late last night because I still wasn't settled on how one should read this verse. And the Greek term used for innocence or for purity is akarpaios, which is literally translated unmixed. Be unmixed. And many of the Jewish laws originally had to do with not mixing stuff, keeping categories separate. That was very important in many of the laws. But perhaps the best for me, this unmixed, it made me think of my Afrikaans Bible, because I remember this text from my childhood and from my first few years in the ministry. The Afrikaans word used for that innocence is opreg, which means to act with good intent and consistently do what is right. That is what you do when you are opreg. And the Afrikaans verse says, be clever as the snakes and always act with good intent, consistently doing what is right. And perhaps that is where we should come down on this, especially for us living in this time, and make ourselves part of the restoration team for the fiber and the essential fabric of U.S. society again, and also as we wrestle as members of this community and these communities in Topsfield with our issues. It is treacherous and complex terrain. We often lack wisdom to decide how exactly to go about our business. But perhaps we should do this looking at an unmixed and opregte, to use the Afrikaans term, approach. To acknowledge the complexity of what we are dealing with and the intensity of the commitment in issues. To go about in the tradition that we stand in, with Jesus and the interpretation of that tradition by somebody outside our tradition like Gandhi, but also like somebody in our tradition like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To resist what we think is not right, and be willing to always enter into conversation, to do it in such a way that we not demean ourselves or in the process destroy what we say that we stand for. To consistently be pure in our commitment to do what is right. To be willing perhaps to compromise on the outcome. When we seek to end here, we may say, all right, I'll accept this. But to be uncompromising on our method and our behavior, so that there can be no question that we are not violating the essence of what we claim to be. And I'm speaking to you as somebody that do not know much, but I think at least I understand the complexity of what I'm sharing with you. And let us journey together as God's people. not compromising in our love for one another, not compromising on the behavioral contract that we enter into when we declare ourselves as being part of this community towards one another and towards anybody else. Let us go out, as Jesus said, I'm sending you out into a world where you will walk as sheep among wolves. Let us be clever as the snakes, pure, innocent, oprecht, unmixed as the doves. Amen.